Hey listeners, we're jumping into this bid license hearing about an hour in. The first speaker is the presiding gentleman from New York. The panelists include Barry Silbert, founder and CEO of Second Market, Jeremy Liu, partner at Lightspeed Ventures, Fred Wilson, partner at Union Square Ventures. The panel wraps up with Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss of Winklevoss Capital Management. Enjoy.
Do you think it's fair to say, and I think it's in all of your testimony, but I just want to hear if you want to put any gloss on it or any nuances, that going forward, the virtual currency world to sort of thrive and succeed and become more mainstream is ultimately going to have to really embrace regulation. Like I think I said in my opening statement, there are some people in the Bitcoin community from the libertarian side of things that want government to just leave it alone. Would you say regulation is both inevitable, but more importantly, actually ultimately going to be crucial for the survival of virtual currency?
I think one of the challenges you have as a regulator with respect to Bitcoin is that it's a global phenomenon. And if you look at the landscape, both kind of from a regulation perspective and tax perspective, you're seeing a lot of different approaches to how to regulate Bitcoin and how to tax Bitcoin. And I do believe that, I think Jeremy made the point earlier, that one of the reasons why the dominant exchanges are located overseas is because of the uncertainty around how those businesses should be regulated. And I think, unfortunately, that's a missed opportunity. And I do hope that we kind of right the ship and the dominant exchanges end up in the U.S. and, quite frankly, here in New York. So I think over time, the regulators are going to have to come up with a way to treat Bitcoin that is balanced and thoughtful, but also recognize that this is a global phenomenon. And as much as certain policymakers, certain regulators may hate the idea of Bitcoin, typically once they dig in, they come to appreciate the power of it. Recognizing that the companies are going to get created, jobs are going to get created, innovation is going to happen. We've got to figure out a way to do it in a balanced way so that it happens here in the U.S. and hopefully here in New York.
Mr. Liu.
Speaking selfishly as an investor, I think that having clarity around regulation that's based in the U.S. And here in New York, which can serve as a positive example for other regulatory regimes as they develop around the world, is likely to be a very positive thing. I think that, again, it needs to be balanced and it needs to be appropriate so that the innovation can occur, because if it isn't, then that innovation will occur outside of the boundaries of the U.S. And, again, as an investor, that's less interesting to me, and I frankly think it's less good for consumers.
Mr. Wilson, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that there's going to be regulation. There should be regulation, and clarity is important. The other thing that I think is important is to recognize that many of these new companies are 2, 3, 4-person companies, and it's very difficult for them to do the same thing that J.P. Morgan Chase does. I think when they grow up, they should be expected to do exactly the same thing that J.P. Morgan Chase does. But I think there needs to be some idea of a on-ramp to regulation that is inviting of these young companies to engage with the regulatory environment in a way that they can actually do it. That's the issue. It's not that they don't want to do it. It's like, I got to run my servers, I got to write my code, I got to deal with my customers, and I got to apply for money transfer licenses in all 50 states. And so I just would encourage you all to be mindful of that challenge and not expect a 3-person company to be able to do the same thing that a global company with hundreds of thousands of employees can do. And I think if you do that, I think everything should be just fine.
It's a fair point, and I think the Winklevoss brothers mentioned this in their testimony, in their written testimony as well. Look, we, on the regular old banking side, forget the internet for a minute, and the virtual world, we deal with the mega banks who have thousands and thousands of people working there, but we also deal with about 80 mostly upstate community banks, some of which have 10, 15, 8 employees. And one thing we're always cognizant of is not applying the same compliance costs or imposing the same compliance costs on a J.P. Morgan or a Goldman Sachs that we do these smaller community banks. You would drive them out of business. And sometimes when you see some of the federal regulations that are hitting those smaller community banks, I once got a call from a CEO who said, I now have 3 loan officers, and 12 compliance officers. I said to them, well, your business is going to fail under that model. And so I think it's something we're certainly cognizant of. The flip side, of course, is we want to make sure that, yes, there's this on-ramp period, but how do we ensure, again, we're moving away from a world where illicit activities are going on and more towards a world where we're encouraging innovation, we're encouraging exchanges to come to New York, we're encouraging more high-tech companies to come and build new architecture on top of what's already being built here in New York and elsewhere in the U.S., as opposed to pushing it offshore. But it's a very tricky proposition to get that balance right. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, it's good that you already have some examples with the community banks where you understand this and you've come up with ways to deal with it. I think that should be, a roadmap for how to think about some of these really small Bitcoin companies, and so that's very encouraging to hear.
I would add one other point, which is I think the sort of cost part of the regulatory burden is definitely one issue for the small companies. The time part is also another very important point, because these small companies, they're driven on innovation, and the quicker that they can cycle their innovation, the more likely you are to see really new, interesting, novel ideas coming out of them. And that's why sort of long holding periods and things that prevent them from getting to market quickly, not cost issues, but time issues that prevent them from getting to market, finding a customer, and finding that product market fit can really dampen innovation as well.
Yeah, I was a good metaphor for this is the music industry. So there are literally thousands of startups that have wanted to create new music listening experiences over the past 15 years, and it takes 2 or 3 years and probably several $1 million of legal fees to get the rights to stream music legally. And most, say 95% of those companies aren't going to build something that more than 5 or 10 or 20,000 people actually even care about. So the idea that you would require every single one of them to get fully licensed by the music industry before they even know if they built something that matters makes no sense. And yet that's how the music industry is operated. And when a startup walks into the offices of a music executive and says, I've been operating for 6 months, now all of a sudden the service is working and we're really successful, and now we need to get rights, the first thing that they're handed with is a lawsuit, right? Like, that's not the right way to engage with a young entrepreneurial company. And so I just think as long as the regulatory environment doesn't behave that way too, and understands that sometimes an entrepreneur needs to build something and put it in the market to see if anybody even cares before they go and ask for the permission to operate, that's actually a good thing, and that we should allow that societally. We should allow that to happen across all industries. And then once it turns out that there's a real business there, the money will come, the regulation will come, and all of that can happen in good time. That's really important.
Yeah,
and a good counterexample that has encouraged that would have been, for instance, Google or Facebook APIs, which are free up to a certain point, and therefore encourage the innovation. But then after they reach, after a customer starts to reach a certain size, then it's a business relationship.
Yeah, no, look, I think there's a lesson for regulators in there too, which is, again, our money transmitter rules were written way back, and the process was often much slower, and it frankly didn't matter. It wasn't that the technology of the money transmission that was behind the money transmission businesses we were licensing wasn't changing every few months. And so it didn't matter if the licensing process took a year, 9 months, whatever it is. We, about 2 years ago, when we started to see applications for money transmission from the likes of Google and Facebook and the different wallets that were out there, realized that our normal procedures and our normal processes had to be modernized. They didn't make sense anymore in a digital age, and that by the time we were licensing someone, the technology had changed entirely. It was a fool's errand. So I think we're going to have to, as we consider whether we need a bit license or something like that, we also need to think internally at DFS about how we can be a more modern digital regulator. It's not simply what our rules are. It's also who we employ, how quickly we act, what our reviews are like. There's a lot to do.
Here's one thing to just think about. It would seem to me that step one in a modern regulatory framework would be for an entrepreneur to simply let you know that they're operating in your state. Many entrepreneurs tell me that they don't want to do that because if they were to do that, your response could be, probably wouldn't, but could be, to shut them down immediately. And so that they choose not to do that. If there were a safe harbor of some sort for an entrepreneur who willingly notified you that I am in business, I am operating, and I am operating in your state, and then that there was some time period, a year or 6 months or 12 months or 18 months or whatever that time period is, I don't know what it is, for them to move through the licensing process in partnership with you, but that they wouldn't necessarily be shut down. They knew that they wouldn't be shut down for simply reporting that they're operating. Then you would know of everybody who's operating in your state because there would be no reason not to report. And anybody who chose not to report would clearly be, probably not on the up and up. So something like that is kind of what I'm talking about.
Let me raise you one. How would you react to a safe harbor that if you want to qualify for the safe harbor, you also need to have you need to show some basic level of Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering, compliance rules put in place?
I think the question is how burdensome are those things for a 3 or 4 or 5 person operation, and the lighter that they are, the more that they can be implemented in code as opposed to in labor, and the more that someone could get compliant quickly with those things. I think those are good ideas. I think if it requires somebody to go raise $1 million or hire 5 people, then that could be hard for people. And that, again, might cause somebody to not self-report. So I think that's really the thing you want to think about is if you can encourage people to be compliant because the cost of being compliant, at least initially, is not very large, and then over time that cost just grows as their business either grows or doesn't grow. I think that's a really good regulatory approach in the modern age.
If I may, but isn't that where you folks come in? Regulation has always been a barrier to entry in every market. And the way you've just described a 2 or 3 person operation can, in worst case scenario, wreak havoc. And we need to be very careful about that. So just simply knowing that someone is operating is not a sufficient safety net. Isn't it the role of the investor to analyze any one particular business plan over another and say, there's something here, and sufficiently fund, and you have a natural selection going on such that when you do open the door, you have adequate money laundering protections, you have adequate solvency, all these things are in place. It'd be great in any industry if you could just open the door and let folks run out and give a shot. But it's one thing when you're dealing with copyright violation. It's another thing when you're dealing with a situation where someone could be sending terrorist funding or engaging in some other illicit activity, which after the fact we found, a few months into it, even though they told us, would be tremendously problematic.
Well, I think there's 2 separate issues that you raise. One is the due diligence that we do when we make an investment, and we certainly do that due diligence. We want to make sure that the company's operating on the up and up, and we want to make sure that they have some compliance in place and they have some know your customer in place or things like that. That may not be the level of compliance and anti-money laundering and know your customer that you might expect. So there could be a gap there. The other issue I think you need to think about is that we may choose not to invest in a company if they can't get licensed by you. And so there's going to be this chicken and egg problem that gets in the way of innovation, where an investor's not going to plunk down the $2 or $3 million that it's going to take to get licensed until you're licensed. And then nobody's going to get funded. So I think these are in some ways theoretical conversations, but I think it's important for you all to understand our world and the world of the entrepreneur, so that at least you can be open-minded to some of these things. You have your job, you got to do it. We got our job, we got to do it. The entrepreneurs have their job, they got to do it. But the more we understand the realities of each other's jobs, I think the better off we're all going to be.
And the one thing that I would just modify, Fred's comments is, if that's the condition of entry for a company to be started in the U.S. or in New York, then maybe we won't do it. But if that same company could be started in the UK or in Germany or somewhere else, then maybe that innovation just gets pushed offshore, and that seems like a net loss to the U.S.
Look, again, it raises a broader question, and maybe we'll have, and I'd like to get your opinions on this because maybe we'll have different perspectives. If the choice ultimately is between preventing money laundering on the one hand, and I probably even shouldn't use the word money laundering because it's too nice a word, frankly. Money laundering is the facilitation of all kinds of horrific crimes that I think everyone in this room never wants to see happen. Narco trafficking being one, but acts of terrorism, funding rogue nations, et cetera, all take place through massive money laundering. Now, we have it in our system as we do now. But if to have money laundering, if the choice for the regulator is permit money laundering on the one hand or permit innovation on the other, we're always going to choose squelching the money laundering first. It's not worth it to society to allow money laundering and all of the things it facilitates to persist in order to permit 1,000 flowers to bloom on the innovation side. I think the question is whether we can get somewhere in between where we're very comfortable that we're preventing the money laundering, but still allowing innovation. But I guess I would open it up to the panelists. I could start down here. Would you agree that ultimately if the choice is, and maybe this is an unfair question, but ultimately the choice is between getting rid of money laundering but squelching innovation, that we all agree the first job is to get rid of the money laundering, all that it facilitates?
I mean, I agree there's definitely a tension there. Nobody wants to see money laundering. But I think we can reach that middle ground and understanding in hearings like this, just keeping a very open dialogue so it's not us versus them or regulators or this mysterious body. I think we can find that dialogue and middle ground where we can kind of have a firm understanding and we don't lose innovation, but at the same time don't permit criminal behavior.
I agree that I don't think anybody wants money laundering. When we first saw Bitcoin, about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, I don't think anybody would deny that it was a bit of a wild, wild west because there was no regulation, there was no framework to evaluate the asset, evaluate companies, determine who was compliant, who was not. And a Wild West, attracts cowboys. And I don't think anybody here would disagree with the fact that a sheriff would be a good thing. It's just how do we sort of apply that law? I kind of like the concept that Fred brought up about a bit of a safe harbor where if you register and let us know what you're doing for a certain period of time so we can kind of build our technology and focus on what we do well, and the investors can focus on what they do well, which is basically coming up to speed on Bitcoin, doing the due diligence on the startup, as opposed to having to become also a regulatory expert. I think that will at least allow these sort of nascent companies that are small with small funding from sort of building their technology and seeing if it works, and it also sort of doesn't have to necessarily recreate. Basically, the culture of investors is not to basically be paying millions of dollars into startups to make sure that they're compliant. And I'm not saying that that will always be the case, but I think it's one of the things entrepreneurs have sort of run their head up against is going to investors and saying, I need capital for this and also this huge sum for regulatory compliance and lawyers. Now, I think one potential outcome that could come from the type of regulation that we're talking about is startups that are geared towards helping other startups be compliant. So for just like a startup doesn't, generally speaking, they would outsource their email suite or applications to, let's say, Google Apps. They're not worrying about their IT. They're basically outsourcing that to the cloud. If there's clear regulation, I would not be surprised if there's other companies that come out and say, look, if you're an exchange or you're a money transmitter or you're dealing in Bitcoin
exchanges to fiat, we're going to help you be compliant. We're going to take that, offload that burden from you and take care of that. The problem right now, though, is there's no sort of clear regulation where the companies can basically be licensed as a compliance type company. So that's just one outcome I see that could potentially solve the problem that we're all talking about here.
It's an interesting idea because certainly there is an entire industry right now helping banks try to stay compliant, for better and worse sometimes, with our BSA AML rules. And certainly there's an industry already out there that could, maybe part of or a piece of it could be spun off more into the virtual world to try and help fledgling companies do that. But it would be a way to ensure that, yes, it's a small company, yes, we want them to innovate, but at the same time, we just can't live in a world where we're going to permit money laundering to go on.
Well, that sounds like a terrible idea to me. You're talking about introducing all of the costs back into the system that we're trying to take out of the system. Okay, let's just understand what we're trying to do with Bitcoin. We're trying to create a world where transactions can move globally for free, okay? And making these companies hire, some outsourced compliance firm is a bad idea. The good idea is to put the compliance into the code. Okay. Just yesterday, I opened a bank account with Deutsche Bank because I got distributed some stock from a venture fund I'm in, and Deutsche Bank was the agent who was pressed. So I have to open a bank account. I had to fill out 5 separate pieces of paper. I had to file an AML form. I had to file an account opening form. I had to file out a W-9. I had to file out, make sure that I wasn't a partner in some brokerage firm, all this stuff, right? If I could have just authed with my Facebook account, okay, if I could have just gone to the Deutsche Bank website and auth with my Facebook, they would have gotten most of that information directly from Facebook, and they could have onboarded me instantly. That's the idea of putting it into code. Now, you may say, look, Facebook can't act as the know your customer provider for the world. And maybe that's right or maybe that's wrong. I don't know. Maybe LinkedIn plus Facebook plus Google plus my social security number plus my global entry number. I don't know what it is, but something like that could handle, AML, know your customer in code as opposed to this really heavyweight compliance infrastructure that we're now enforcing on companies is the right answer. That way you can do compliance at scale for no money, and we can drive the cost down to the consumer of doing transactions down to zero. Of course, we need to stop bad people from moving money, but by making me have to fill out 5 forms, I'm a good guy. That's not a good answer, in my opinion.
EasyDNS is the Swiss Army knife for your domain names, helping meet their customers' individual needs since 1998. EasyDNS has been an outspoken critic of SOPA and CISPA. EasyDNS was an early supporter of Bitcoin, and now they are proud to sponsor this show. Do business with a company that shares your values. Get a 13% discount when you pay with Bitcoin. Go to bitcoin.easydns.com and be sure to use discount code LTB.